Good evening, everybody. Make sure you have your handout when you came in. We're Daniel chapter 5 is our chapter for this evening. So tonight your handout is much more simplified. So I would encourage you to have a pen ready so you can be able to take notes to fill in. Rather than me just kind of giving you everything that I have, I'm just basically outlining the way by which I'm going to teach through chapter 5. And that is based upon the main characters or object that actually occurs in this chapter. As you will see, there's really kind of several things that are there. We have Belshazzar, we have the hand of God, we have the queen, we have Daniel that is there. Then we're going to see that repeated again. Then we're going to see the hand again. Then we're going to see Daniel again at the very end as well. Now, in this chapter, we actually have a time gap between chapter 4 and chapter 5. I mentioned that to you a couple weeks ago, between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. And what I mean by that is that Belshazzar is not the immediate succeeding king after Nebuchadnezzar. And so as we look at this chapter, I'm going to do some explanation about that in regards to why is Nebuchadnezzar called Belshazzar's father, even though that he is not his actual biological father. We're going to understand that in regards to the culture. So one of the things that we teach quite frequently when we're talking about studying the scriptures is understanding a scripture in its context and making certain that we understand the background and its historicity, the land by which it's written, what the cultural elements were of that day. And we can't place upon our particular culture upon that culture, so we didn't understand it. So we're talking about a Babylonian culture because that's the kingdom that is in power, and so we're going to need to understand that. When we talk about the queen, when we get to the queen in regards to who speaks in verse 10, we have to ask the same question. Who's the queen? Is it Belshazzar's wife as the queen, or are we talking about somebody else as the queen? So we will be able to understand that hopefully as we look at this as well. And then we're going to ask the question in regards to which hand is actually here. Obviously, I'm kind of alluding to that already. I've called it the hand of God that's mentioned here. And so we're going to try to make sure, how can we really know that very clearly that is in this particular chapter. Now, I want to remind you of the theme of this book. So we're going to start at chapter 2, verse 44. We've seen several things that have occurred just in the first few chapters of the book of Daniel. And then when we get into chapter 6, we're going to see where there's also a change of a kingdom. We're going to switch to the Persian kingdom from the Babylonian kingdom, and then it switches back again in regards to going back to the Babylonian kingdom in regards to the book, not necessarily chronology. I'm going to show you the theme, and then I'm going to look ahead with you to help you to see how we're going to have to look at this book. All right, so chapter 2, verse 44, I've said to you, I believe is really the central theme of this book. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Remember, this is the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw, and it was the gold head and the silver, and it broke down into different metals. And we talked about the different kingdoms that was being prophesied, really being given to him as a warning in regards to his kingdom is going to come to an end. And then what we see in that is God is making very clear that the only kingdom that's not going to be destroyed is God's kingdom. And also what's stated here is that kingdom is already being built. It's not something to be waited for. We talked about what that means for us as we're a part of a kingdom, that no matter what happens in our life, in our world, that our kingdom is the one that would never be destroyed. It is an eternal kingdom. So when we get to chapter 5 and we get to Belshazzar, we're coming to the end of the Babylonian Empire that's about to come to an end. But I want to show you, if you're reading ahead so that you don't get confused, I want to show you how these next couple of chapters, they bounce back and forth in regards to chronology. If you'll look at chapter 6 with me, you'll notice who is being referred to, and that is Darius. Darius the king is also a Mede king. What we're going to learn in regard to what the Medes, the Persian and Medes, the Mede-Persian Empire is what it's referred to at times. Eventually it gets referred to as the Persian Empire because there were two different empires. There was the Mede Empire, there was the Persian Empire, and eventually the Persians rise up and take over the Medes and becomes known as the Persian Empire. But look with me, if you would, to chapter 7 and notice who is being referred to in chapter 7 now. It's Belshazzar again. Okay, so what happens is he's referring back in that time. So what's being said to us here very clearly in chapter 8 is the same way. Chapter 8 also talks about Belshazzar, and then when you get to chapter 9, if you're just tracking with me, in chapter 9, you'll notice again it refers back to Darius. Now that doesn't mean that Belshazzar comes back into power. It's just the way by which that Daniel is simply trying to refer to the points that he's trying to make. Oftentimes, this is the way sometimes things are written. Not everything is always written in a chronological order, so you have to make sure you're paying attention as you're reading through the book. Okay, but tonight we are looking at Belshazzar, who is close to the end of the Babylonian Empire. Rather than just reading the entire chapter, I'm just going to read the sections and talk through that. You can ask questions if you have them as it pertains to the particular outline that is there. We're going to read verses 1 through 4. Let's talk about King Belshazzar in regards to who he is and what this is saying about us. So here's the question I want to ask you to give us food for thought, for you to give me the answer after we read this. What can you think this says about the character of Belshazzar just in these first 4 verses? Remember Nebuchadnezzar that we had seen in the previous chapter? He had a very humbling experience. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar? He went insane. He became like a beast. He went out, and for how long? It's like, we know it's like 7 seasons, 7 years is what some people may say. So it's a long period of time. And chapter 4 ends with him giving praise to the King of Heaven, exalting him as the mighty God. We don't know for certain if he became a true believer, but yet as a king, that's a pretty bold statement, especially from a polytheistic king. It's saying that God himself is the highest king of all. So when we get to chapter 5, and we read about Belshazzar, that's the reason why I'm giving you this background. I want you to think through, what does this say about him as a king? Now remember, what name did Nebuchadnezzar give Daniel? Belshazzar. Okay, very similar, so don't confuse. Not the same. So we're literally just missing one letter, the letter T. All right, let's read verses 1 through 4. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank for them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. All right, from that little small synopsis, what does this show you about this man? He didn't learn anything from his father. And what do you mean by that? You're right, correct. He is a proudful, arrogant dude. Okay? And so why are we saying that, though? I mean, just from those 3 verses. What's the insight? I mean, you're right on, Dean.
Because he has no respect for the dreams that were interpreted that God is the God.
Absolutely. So he has no regard for what has been told to Nebuchadnezzar. So there's either it hasn't been told to him, or he simply ignores it. Because remember, the Babylonian Empire was a very huge empire at this time. I mean, it's massive. And so even Nebuchadnezzar, remember what was said to him. He was like the King of Kings and like the Lord of Lords. I mean, he was a very accomplished king in this line. And so, yes, anything else that you would say about him, it's here. He didn't respect what should be holy. Okay, and why are you saying that? Okay, so but is it the first thing he's doing? Is this what he starts his festival off with? No, he's already drinking, and then he goes and calls for it. So there is a disregard for what comes from God, but if he's a polytheistic worshiper, then he's not really going to care. But nevertheless, to disregard the things that were of God, God still considers them in that particular way, which I think is partially why we also have the judgment that's about to come as well. Okay, now what you see here is everything you said is correct. Now notice who's doing the drinking. Yeah, so he's drinking notice the text, what it says. He's drinking in front of the Lord's. So it's a way by which they would be starting off their festivals, an official wine, particular component that is there. He's drinking in front of them. Now later in the chapter, we're going to say that they all are going to be drinking. But here, it's almost like he's flamboyant in regards to who he is, what he's doing. And then, as Rashera says, he then says, well, go call those particular cups from what my father had given. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yes, so they would have gotten them and they would have brought them, to the palace or whatever they're storing them as, but they've not been taken since then, and so that's correct. That's correct. Yeah, so he's going against lots of different normalities in what is happening here. Now, why do we know this is flamboyant as well and prideful? There's something that we'd had to read through the whole chapter to be able to see, but I want to show you this so you can see why this is so flamboyant by Belshazzar. Go to verse 30 of this same chapter. We're fast forwarding to the end, but I think it's important that you understand the background of why this is so flamboyant and arrogant. All right, verse 30. That very night, now this is all happening in one day, so you understand. This one chapter is a one-day event. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. Now remember, Chaldean is another word for the Babylonian. He was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. Now, why is that important that we understand? So this place where he is at, I want you to understand his palace and the security of the palace, and just track with me just for a moment so you can understand the historicity of his arrogance. There was a Greek historian and philosopher that lived from 430 BC to about 350 BC. His name was Xenophon. And Xenophon says that this place by which that Belshazzar was a fortified area, such that if they were going to be attacked, they had enough supplies that they could have stayed fortified and lasted for years. So, according to history, the army is actually already outside the walls. Now, the king would have known this, because they had watchmen, which was normal for palaces and walled cities to have. So if he knows, now this is according to historical documents, that the Medes are around him, and he's sitting inside, drinking it up. Now, what does that say about him? That's exactly right. Could be afraid, so he's drinking it up to numb himself. Well, I think he's probably more. I don't think he's afraid because of the way by which he treats this whole situation and what's said about him. I think that Belshazzar is probably just as much, if not more, arrogant than Nebuchadnezzar was. Yeah.
There, in
That's correct. Absolutely. All right. As far as like letting the Medes in, is that what you mean? Um, so Jameson and I were actually talking about this afternoon, and I haven't read this particular historical document. He had read something where that it was possible that some of the people who were actually out for war, there was someone who actually was negligent and just left one of the back gates open. And so in their drunkenness, in particular this moment, they're neglecting it, and I think part of their pride has caused the fall of what has taken place as well. All right, go back to verse 2 through 4, and I want you to see now what this does show us is what we've already alluded to, and y'all have alluded to it. This action, what is happening here, the fact that it's making mention that he's actually taking what Nebuchadnezzar took out, shows that he has really no regard for what has taken place as well. Now, let's talk about what I've alluded to earlier. This text calls Nebuchadnezzar in verse 2 his father. But he's not by his biological father according to records. So why does this say his father? Well, on your paper you see a chart that shows you the succession of kings after Nebuchadnezzar, and you'll see Belshazzar at the bottom there. Nabonidus is actually Belshazzar's biological father. So look at the dates between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar dies at 562. Belshazzar begins reigning at 552. So a difference of 10 years that is there. So why then do we have this reference to Nebuchadnezzar as being called his father, and Belshazzar is not his son? Say again? Yeah. So there's not a term that is listed in Hebrew as like grandfather. This is not uncommon in regards to culture for someone to make reference to a father that could be many generations removed. Let me show you an example of this in the New Testament where Jews are actually referring to Abraham as their father. Okay, look at John 8, verse 39. And the reason I'm pointing this out is that there is this time gap that we don't have between these kings. And remember, the Bible's purpose is to show us the whole thematic line of redemption and the main storyline of what's taking place within its history and what God is doing to bring this kingdom to an end. And again, the purpose is to show us how the Persian Empire comes into power, because it's through the Persian Empire that the people of God get to go back to Jerusalem. They get to go back to their homeland. So this book, Daniel, is showing us that line. Okay, in John chapter 8 and verse 39, again, this is where Jesus is talking with the Pharisees. And notice what they say in verse 39. They answered him, "Abraham is our father." Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing what Abraham did. So clearly you see where it's not uncommon to call someone that's multiple generations removed your father. Okay, now go back to Daniel chapter 5. Just wanted you to see that as an example. Now I also want you to look at the chart that's on your paper. Notice, if you looked at it closely already, you may be saying, well, wait a minute, Belshazzar's dates of rule are actually during the time that his father ruled of Nabonidus. Does everybody see that? Nabonidus is 555, and Belshazzar reigns from 552, and then his father ends in 539, but Belshazzar ends at 542. That's within that time frame. So why, in Daniel chapter 5, is Belshazzar referred to as king? You say, what's the big deal about this? This chapter is one of the chapters that skeptics throw darts at Daniel as reliability. So hear me out on this chapter and this explanation. This is important. especially if you're talking to someone who wants to challenge you in regards to the reliability of Scripture. Because they will say, historical records prove that Nabonidus was the last ruling king of the Babylonian Empire. And they're not incorrect. He is the last ruling king. So why then does Daniel refer to Belshazzar as the king? There's actually been some archaeological evidence that's been shown that there is a period of time where Nabonidus actually goes away into Arabia area. And he's gone for like 10 years. And while he is gone, people have tried to hypothesize as to why he is gone. Some say he went away for illness because there was an amazing oasis that was where he was, and so he stayed there. Some say that because of the worship of Marduk that was taking place back in Babylon, that he didn't want to be a part of that because he worshiped the god of sin. No one really knows why, but he was still alive, and so while he was away, his son was co-regent. So he served as king while his father was away. So it's not unbiblical or wrong historically. So just put that in your mind. If you can understand that, it's important to know that. So we don't really know why, again, that his father is gone, but it's not wrong for us to call him king. Now, why is that also important? Look at verse 16. We'll get there in a minute, but I just want you to see these connections. So in a moment, we're going to read that Belshazzar sees his handwriting and on the wall, and he needs somebody to interpret it. And if someone will interpret it, he gives them this promise of what rank they could become. Now, if you understand what I just explained to you, it makes sense now why he says what he says. Okay? Verse 16, I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. He couldn't offer him anything higher. Why? Because he's second, that's right. Does that make sense now? Because like before when I read that, I'm like, well, that's kind of a side. You're only going to make him third? But then when you understand he's co-regent, then you begin to understand he can't offer him anything else. But that's still an amazing offer, though. I mean, to be third rank. In our Bible history, in regards to your Bible knowledge, who else just in history got raised to power that was a Jewish individual? Joseph did, correct. He went from prisoner to being only second to behind Pharaoh himself. Okay, so now you understand that. Now, let's look at, I believe that also within those first few verses, we have willful mockery. It's not just disregard for his father, but I think it's also willful mockery in regards to what he is seeing about those Jewish people. You know, he's referring to them, go get those things, go get those golden vessels that was in the temple and bring those back out. So I think it's also mockery towards them and to God himself. Okay, now, I think that there's a little bit of drunkenness that's already taken place. He's been drinking the wine, and now that he's kind of tanked a little bit, and then he's like flamboyant, hey, just go get all that other stuff, let's bring it in here. Okay, so this is the background of Belshazzar, and I believe it's for that. I think what we're seeing in this moment probably is the finality of the grace that has been extended to him, and now the grace is run out. And because of his final mockery and his arrogance and his pride, God is about to speak. He's not speaking audibly. He's not speaking through a prophet. He's going to be speaking with a hand. Okay. So let's look here at verses 5 through 8. Or 5 through 9, rather, excuse me. All right, immediately, notice that. So he's done this, he's called for it, and then immediately, you see. So this again is where God is not being simply passive in regards to these moments. He's waiting for this moment, and now this has happened, and God is acting. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. Guy's scared to death, right? So now, Becky, I think he's afraid. Okay. Yeah. Verse 7. So the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple, have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. Now, I just simply pose a question to you here. If that's the king, and you've got all of your leadership and power in front of you, what does this display about a king and his kingly state in this moment? What is he portraying about himself? Weakness, contrasting what has he just portrayed to them? Arrogance. He's literally shaking in his boots, because obviously this is not just the wine that's speaking to him now. There's something that is in this moment that he knows this is not normal. Now, according to what I've read in regards to the way his palace was, this is most likely on like a back wall that no one else is really seeing it. It's just him who's seen this particular moment. We don't know that for sure, but it seems to be that that's what he's seeing. No one else is seeing it. So everybody else is seeing him, color changing, knees knocking. But notice what he does. He doesn't like quietly say, hey, can you get me the enchanters? What does he do? He's screaming out for them. Okay, so imagine you're at a party, and then all of a sudden you're seeing this one person who's the host who's screaming out. You're thinking, this person has lost their mind. So he's literally completely lost his control. Okay, now, in this, when we understand that he calls them, notice verse 8. I want you to tell me why no one can read the writing. Because I said, well, he's saying this there. They see it because he's brought them in. What, Tiffany? God's not telling it to them. Did y'all say something? Did you say something?
I said it's from God Most High.
Yeah. So I think that what we have here in this particular moment, it's not like it's a huge encrypted message. It's just a few words. And so these are vocabulary words that's written. The issue, I believe, is that it has to, I think what you're saying, it's written from God, and it has to be a person of God to be able to explain this message. It's much like, I'll illustrate it this way. You know, Jesus taught in parables, and the New Testament says that he taught in parables for some things to be hidden from certain people and then for it to be understood by some people. And so here we have this particular writing that is written. I've read some things today that said, some people say it's possibly written in some kind of this particular form. I'm like, no, he tells us what it is. It's words of what it's supposed to be. They just can't get it. Now, who's missing in this group? Again, Daniel. Why? He what? He wouldn't have been partying with him.
Well, as you read further down, it seems like he's not even aware of who Daniel is.
That's exactly right. Remember what Tammy said. It seems to be this king has no idea who Daniel is. I believe that it seems to be that Daniel is no longer in the position that Nebuchadnezzar had given him. What position and rank had Daniel arisen to? Chief prefect. He would have been the chief over all these individuals. So if he was chief prefect, remember, where was he supposed to be living? In the palace, and he's not around. Which means somehow, we're not told how or who of these kings that preceded Belshazzar where he would have gotten removed. We don't know. But what we clearly know is he's not around, he's not here, he's not sought for. Okay? So we clearly see that God is speaking. Now, what's the difference here? How is God speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, or how did he, and how did God speak differently now to Belshazzar? Nebuchadnezzar seemed to be having frequent dreams. And God spoke to him. Remember, we read that he would have dreams, but there was a dream that disturbed him. And so now we see that God is doing a different method, obviously to get a way by which he needs to get Belshazzar's attention. We're not reading in regards to Nebuchadnezzar like like Nebuchadnezzar, that he's frequently having dreams. It's a way by which God is speaking to him that's different. Okay. Think of Belshazzar, you're saying? Because
Well, I'm saying, it doesn't tell us that he was constantly having these parties, but if he was having these parties, maybe getting drunk, maybe he would have just thought it was because of
oh, I see what you're saying. Okay,
drunken state as opposed to.
gotcha. But obviously he recognizes there's something a little bit different than the one that's speaking. Okay, all right. Now let's go to the queen. I want us, as we read about the queen, I want you to pay attention to think through who is she possibly, and then I want you to pay attention in regards to what she says to Belshazzar, and not just what she says, but how she says it. Okay, who she possibly is, what she says, how she says it. Okay, let's read it. Verses 10 through 12. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him, and King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Okay, now let's make the connection in regards to who the queen possibly is. Now, if you remember back earlier in the first few verses, back up in verse 2, notice that Belshazzar has who with him? Wives are there. Okay, so the queen would have most likely have been there, that if this queen would have been his wife. So in this particular culture, again, is that mothers were seen in regard of respect, even the same thing in Israel's kind of culture as well. You would see them respected and held in high esteem in regard to what they would say. But remember, walking into the king, he's not necessarily in his private chambers. Where is he? What's happening right here? This is like a big public scene, okay? So she's not endangering herself by going there. But what's implied by this is that she's not there. So how does she hear about this? Possibly the screaming that's there. But notice verse 10. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords. What would that possibly imply? Some of the lords, remember now when we say there's 1,000 that's there, I think that's probably just simply giving a number, like there's a lot of people that's there. Could be 1,000 exactly, but someone might be going to get her. You got to get in here. This is what he said. This is what's going on. And so could it have been that one of these lords knew the history, knew what was going on? It's possible. So apparently they know she knows how to deal with this. She knows what's going on. And so they go get her, and that's why she runs in there quickly of the urgency as well. So she comes in. I don't think this is his wife. I think that in a very similar way, this is either his mother or it could have been Nebuchadnezzar's wife. So the same way we're talking about the queen that's here, I think it's either one of those. We don't know exactly. But what we do know is that the way by which she says things are not just giving historical information. All right, so I ask you two questions. What is she saying? how is she saying it? What is she saying to Belshazzar? Just summarize it real quickly. What's she saying to him? Say again? I know who can interpret it. All right. Now, how is she saying this? Say again? She's calm. She obviously has some experience with this, which would make it more sensible that this is probably Nebuchadnezzar's wife. Now, what did you say? Say again? Saying it confidently. I think that she's saying it in a way by which she is condemning him. Almost like in a way that it's saying, you didn't listen to the history. Because notice the way by which she says it. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods in the days of your father. And then she says it again. Like the wisdom of the gods were found in him, and King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief. As if to say, you've not paid any attention to the history that was before you. Your father, great-grandfather, he knew him, he made him, so at some point they've just put him out. And anyway, so yes, she's speaking confidently, but I think it's a little bit away by saying, even though that I'm not necessarily the wife and the queen that's in power right now, this is someone that you should have known about. You've gone to all these other sources, and here's the one that actually can help you, and his name is Daniel. Interestingly, she doesn't call him Belteshazzar. She calls him Daniel. Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar called him what? Belteshazzar. So think about this with me. What this means is Daniel is known in regards to who he is. Not just Belteshazzar, which was a name after one of Nebuchadnezzar's gods. She's referring to him as his Hebrew name. That's pretty ironic, pretty amazing in regard to this moment that she's not giving credence to the God that he was named after. Don't miss that. So this is why I'm saying she's making some statements that's here to Belshazzar in regards to who this is. And it's in light of all of Belshazzar's disregard. Remember, what did Belshazzar do? Go get those vessels from the temple. And what is she now saying? I know one that's Daniel. Remember when we talked about the names, the ending part of his name is a part of God's name. All right, so you have this moment here. Now, let's keep moving forward then. Let's talk about, then Daniel gets brought into the scene, which means that Daniel, as we talked about already, is not there in the temple court. He's not there. He wouldn't be there if he's not summoned. I think so. Does everybody hear what Libby is saying here? Remember, in regards to the end of chapter 4, because most likely when Nebuchadnezzar goes out for his insanity, it's most likely probably Daniel and the others that have been put in power that's kind of taking care of the king during that time. And so I think that there was probably a relationship that got established, because the way by which even the king spoke to Daniel referred to him even in Daniel chapter 4. So I think it is very probable that the queen that's being spoken to here knew him on a personal level, not just as there's some guy in this whole kingdom. I mean, I think she's referring to him as someone that she knew experienced it. Okay, so what we're going to do in this next section between 13 and 23, we're going to read a few sections at a time. We're going to read 13 through 16 first, and then we'll point out in regards to what's being said here. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, notice how he says it. You are that Daniel. You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing, make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and it shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now why does he say you are that Daniel? Let's go back to what we had the conversation before. Either he didn't know about him, or either he knew about him and disregarded him. So now the queen is saying, I know someone, his name is Daniel. I think Belshazzar didn't want to have anything to do with him. But now his only hope is have to go to the one who actually helped Nebuchadnezzar. So I think that this tone that is said here shows us that Belshazzar doesn't have a regard for Daniel. Now, he's brought in, which means that we know that he is having to be summoned. He's brought in this here. Now, notice the offer. What's the offer? Very clearly, 3 things that's offered to him. Look at verse 16. What's the offer? Purple, and what else? The gold chain and the third ruler. Sounds pretty good, right? Now we know that purple means royalty, chain is showing is wealth, and then the power in regards to the position. Now, let's read verses 17 through 21, and now let's see what Daniel's response is and what Daniel does. Now, again, what has he been brought in for? To read the interpretation. But Daniel doesn't do that initially. He does something different. He doesn't just simply give the explanation. So pay attention what he does and why he's doing this. Think of it this way. Daniel is using the opportunity that's in front of him to speak. He's not just speaking like a seer. He's speaking as a prophet in this particular moment to this king. All right, verse 17. Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was met with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. What has that to do with the interpretation of the writing on the wall? Reminds you of who? Rehoboam. You talking about Belshazzar? Remind you? Okay. Yeah, I think you said it right. He's using it to school him, to teach him, to explain to him what we have said. We said at the beginning, it seems like he's forgotten the history, and now what's Daniel actually doing? He's laying out the history in regards to not just giving him a history lesson. What was the purpose of that history lesson? What is he implying about Nebuchadnezzar? That God was in control of Nebuchadnezzar, and that he had all the power that he wanted to, but notice what it says. He had the power to kill people, had the power to release people, but it's God humbled him. Meaning, what's implied to Belshazzar? He's about to get humbled. Absolutely. Does everybody hear what Teresa's saying? So the question is, why does he even second guess his response to the king? Like, just keep your stuff. Now remember, what we've said is most likely he's no longer the chief prefect. If you remember the progression of the story in Daniel, he's a Jewish boy, he's put with the Chaldeans to learn the language, and then he gets elevated. So he gets elevated in power a couple of times, and at some point it gets taken from him. We don't know how, we don't know the story there, and so now it's basically like he's already had power, it's offered to him again. The flesh would want that power, so why does he say no to this? He knows what's going to happen. He knows the interpretation of the dream, or interpretation of the writing on the wall. So he's like, I don't need all that. But I think it's also what you said, Teresa, is I think his response is he's saying, I'm not going to be bought. I'm simply serving God, not serving the king with his money. Now it's interesting, at the end of the story, we're going to see that the rewards still get given to him. Now I'm going to ask you the question in a moment, why that happens and what that means. Nebuchadnezzar? I think it's a good possibility. We're not told anything else about it. It's hard to say and hard to know. But I think the way that even Daniel is referring to him here, these many years later, he's referring to him in regards to how he was prideful. Because we don't see a story where he's saying, hey, he didn't learn the lesson, it had to happen again. So I think it's a good possibility he may have actually learned. Okay, now, let's read verses 22 and 23. Now remember, Daniel has given the lesson to prove that God gave his father, great-grandfather, however you want to call it, an opportunity and grace, but he didn't hear it. And then notice what he says in verse 22 and 23. And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart. Here's the key. Though you knew all of this. That verse is the most meaningful verse in this chapter. The way he acted was in complete disregard of what he knew. He is not sinning and acting in ignorance. He is sinning and acting willfully, knowing the history. So what this brings to my mind, as I was just studying this, reading back through this, is these verses that popped in my mind from Proverbs, and it says it in James, it says it in 1 Peter, that God opposes the proud, gives grace to the humble. So everyone is going to be humbled at some point. And so clearly, Daniel is speaking it, that he knew it, but nevertheless he disregarded it. Okay, let's keep reading. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you. And you and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. I want you to notice something in verses 22 and 23. I just want you to glance at it with your eye. Notice the number of times that Daniel uses the pronouns of you and your. Remember, he's pointing out how prideful he is, and I think even now with the grammar, we even see it more clearly. Do you know how many times it's used? 14 times. You, your, yourself, saying that's all about the way we would talk about in our culture is a very self-centered me person. So I think that this is intentional in what's being done here. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the hand and the message. Verse 24 through 28. Then from his presence the hand was sent and the writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, and parsin. Let's stop right there. Let's make sure that we understand. Who's the hand being referred to? Because it says in verse 24, then from his presence the hand was sent. Okay, so whose hand is represented here? God's hand, because he just talked about him in verses 23. And God, whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you've not honored him. From his presence, the hand goes. So he's making the connection here, this antecedent here, the hand is referring back to God and his presence, that he's now making this writing. Okay, now let's read it again, verse 25. This is the writing that was inscribed, mene, mene, tekel, and parsin. Some of your translations may have something different there in parsin. Does it say like uparsin? Does anybody have that there? Some of the older translations actually have that word there, and the uparsin or unparsin is just another word of and. So it's and parsin is what that means here. Don't think it's two different words, okay? Verse 26, this is the interpretation of the manner, meaning God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. We'll stop right there. So 3 words, or 4 if you count meaning twice, that the first people couldn't even understand it. So I've given the explanation to you on your paper. It's from the verbs that's actually these words and what it means. Meaning is from the verb to number. Tekel is from the verb to weigh or assess. And parsin or upparsin from the verb to part or divide. So even if someone could have understood the words and just translated the words, what was needed was to help understand the connection of those words to what God was implying. Simply to have 3 verbs on the wall to make this application could only mean that God had to reveal it to somebody to give that interpretation. In the same way that God gave Daniel the ability to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, he has the ability to interpret these 3 verb words and what they mean. So don't disconnect the meaning. If you understand clearly these verb words, so when he says that mene is from the verb to number, that's why you have the explanation in verse 26. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Now notice, not will bring it to an end, but has brought it to an end. That in itself should have made Belshazzar realize it's over. Then the second one, if you understand the verb, is to weigh and assess, meaning, in verse 27, Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Now, I grew up hearing that phrase a lot in preaching, and I'm like, I never knew what they were talking about. You know, preachers would get up and say, you're in the balances and you've been found wanting. I'm like, I'm on a scale? What are you talking about? But that's what it's referring to, that passage of Scripture, you know. So, but he's using that particular scale that is being mentioned here. So, but who is the standard of the scale? Who is he being weighed against? Not just weight, but weighed in regards to being assessed according to what has he not done? What did Daniel say to him in the previous paragraph? Look at verse 23. At the very end of verse 23, what did Daniel say that he's not done? He's not honored him. So he's found wanting. Wanting in the aspect he's not honored God. Okay? And the last one, parsin, meaning it's going to be divided. This is important. We're talking about the Medes and the Persians, 2 different kingdoms. It's going to come together, but it's given away. Okay. All right, let's get the final actions because we're almost out of time here. Verse 29 through 31. Now, he's already been told his kingdom is coming to an end, correct? It's over. It's brought to an end. Not like we'll be going to remember. That's different than what the message was to Nebuchadnezzar. How was it different for Nebuchadnezzar in the kingdom? On that particular image of the statue, what was told to him about his kingdom?
He was going to have the greatest kingdom for his life,
Yeah, and it's going to, eventually another one's going to come to rise into power. He had time. That's why he starts celebrating, right? Okay, so you would think, well, I got time, doesn't matter. But Belshazzar is like, it's over, man. Done. So remember the first, what was the reward? Robe, gold, and third in power. And Daniel said, I don't want it. What happens? He gives it to him, verse 29. Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, it seems to me like it's kind of brought to Daniel. Like robes put on him, gold's placed upon his neck, and then announcement is made about him. Okay, so whether he stands there willingly and takes it, but Daniel knows the kingdom's coming to an end. So how long does he get to be the third in power? One day, maybe, right? Because it happens that night, right? So even if they put it on him, Daniel's like, what's the point here? He knows it's over for him. But why is Belshazzar doing this? Last ditch effort. Okay. What have we know? What have we said about his character? From the very beginning, how is he acting in all these things? Pride, arrogance. Could he actually be saying, nah, I don't believe that? Remember, how was he acting? How did Daniel describe him when the handwriting came? His color changed. His knees were knocking. But is that happening now? It could very well be that he's like, one of two ways. Either he's probably saying, I don't care. He could be saying, it's not true. Or he could be saying, well, if that's what it is, c'est la vie. I'm going to go out like I'm going to go out. But what we don't see is the response like Nebuchadnezzar had. How did Nebuchadnezzar respond? Now, he did. He got humbled, and then he responded back and then gave praise. Belshazzar, he's going out in pride and arrogance. And that's why we have verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So the question would be, I have three things, I think, as a summation, but I'm going to pose the question to you. And I want you to think about your answer before you give it. Here's the so what question. Okay, we've studied Daniel 5. We've talked about his arrogance and pride. What's the so what to this chapter? What do we learn from this chapter that happened some 2,500 years ago? What does it say to us right now, 2023? Pride can be your downfall. Okay, yes. Now, listen, the first question I tell my kids to ask, what does this teach us about the character of God? First question. Okay, remember chapter 2, verse 44. What did we say? We started with it. He's the king that's going to last forever, and he puts people in power, and he'll take them down. It's not always the way we want it. Okay. For what aspect? Okay, good point. Yes. God decides when that raising and putting it out, because there are things that's happening in our own world right now that we'd say, when is it going to end? Okay, anybody else? Listen to the writing on the wall. Okay, so what's the writing on the wall that we need to listen to?
Give up your pride and humble yourself.
Yeah. More specifically, what's the writing that you have? This is your writing on the wall.
Days are
Mm.
of your wait for the Lord.
Yes. What'd you say, Jason? What were you saying a while ago? I hear you. That's exactly right. You don't always have as much time as you think. Here's 3 things that I have. Number 1.
Proverbs 15:25
Mm-hmm.
says the Lord tears down the house.
Proverbs 15:25. The Lord tears down the house of the proud. Indeed. And that's my.
Maintains the widow.
That maintains the widows.
I like that.
You like that verse? Indeed. Number 1, I have, God will humble the proud at some point in this life or in the life to come. It may be like what you're saying, Teresa, it may not be in this life. But everyone will be humbled. Number 2, we should not presume on the grace of God in regards to the grace that is extended to some. The grace that was extended to Nebuchadnezzar was not the same grace that was extended to Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar had 7 years to be able to ponder that and return, but Belshazzar, how long did he have? It was that night. It reminds me of the story in Luke 12. I would encourage you to go back and read that. Luke 12, verses 13 through 21, the parable of the fool. Tore down his barns, built bigger barns, and then what did Jesus say to him? Say again? Tonight your life is required of you, oh you fool. Same way, we cannot presume upon the grace of God and thinking that we have all the time that we need. And the final thing I have is the scale of measurement is always God and not other people. Always. There were probably kings and other areas that were ruling that that Belshazzar could compare himself to. But the weight in regards when it says in this passage of Scripture that you've been found wanting is always the standard of God and never anybody else. That's who we should compare ourselves to. So when we stand before Him, what are we and who are we relying on? And the grace of Christ. A lot of people are going to be found wanting because they're relying upon their own selves. All right, any questions? We're going to pray together before we go. I'm going to put you into groups and we're going to pray for a few things before we take off. Any questions about Daniel 5? Yes, ma'am.
How old was Daniel? Because he was a young boy when he was taken into exile.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that we're leading up to Daniel in the lion's den because of King Darius. But whenever you think about him in the lion's den, everybody thinks he's going to be a teenage boy,
Mm-hmm.
but he's not. If you do the math from 605 when Nebuchadnezzar was in power to now, that makes Daniel in his late 60s. So is that when he was taken? Was when Nebuchadnezzar first was king?
Yeah.
So his first year?
Yeah, roughly, yes. Yeah. But remember, he also ate well. He ate and God was keeping him healthy. Who knows what he was like? But remember, he doesn't leave. Remember, I mentioned to you guys, I think it's chapter 1 and chapter 2, that he gives us a little bit of snippet and he says that I'm here all the way through Cyrus. So he lets us know. Yeah, he's not a young whippersnapper at this particular point. Mary?
So on the timeline, if I'm reading it correctly, it says his dad ruled 3 years past what he ruled, and then it says Darius ruled the kingdom.
Yep. So he took that particular city where he was on that particular night, but he didn't necessarily take over the whole kingdom that was that moment. So his father does come back historically. I just didn't go there, but his father does come back and he rallies the armies, not necessarily this particular night, and he fends off for a while. So it's not instantly. So it is in 539 is actually when the Persian Empire then actually does take over the Babylonian Empire completely. It's a good question. Any other questions? All right, I want us to pray together. We've got a few minutes before we dismiss.